Good morning. I am Quincy James Reinhardt, Associate Campus Minister and the Bayard Rustin Crown Forum host. My task this morning is to orient you briefly to the life and legacy of Bayard Rustin. My activism, wrote Rustin near the end of his life, did not spring from being Black. Rather, it is rooted fundamentally in my Quaker upbringing and the values instilled in me by my grandparents who reared me. Those values were based on the concept of a single human family and the belief that all members of that family are equal. When people hear the name Bayard Rustin, many are unfamiliar with who this man was or the great accomplishments he made. Those who may be familiar with Rustin automatically link him to homosexuality as an identifier. Although Rustin was gay, he certainly offered more than his sexuality to the cause of social justice. Rustin was a complex person, as most people are. He was born March 17, 1912, in Westchester, Pennsylvania, and was reared by his grandparents, Julia and Jennifer Rustin. The Quaker tradition significantly informed the pacifism Rustin used to help Dr. King fundamentally shape the work of the civil rights movement into the mode of nonviolent resistance. The marginality Rustin experienced in the movement, which was Black church-led, was not because he was a Quaker, but that he was a committed communist and gay. While much of American history has erased Rustin's name from its historical memory, more recently, historians have been writing to resurrect his story to make him again visible. Bayard Rustin was initially exiled from the civil rights movement because he was a gay man and his gayness did not bring capital to the movement. The Bayard Rustin Crown Forum at Morehouse College is named in honor of the angelic troublemaker who was a radical revolutionary, politically astute, a moral cosmopolitan, master strategic organizer, gay Quaker, and social agent who helped to expand the moral consciousness of America and was a strong advocate for holistic transformation both globally and individually. The Bayard Rustin Crown Forum is an ecumenical, interfaith, political, historical platform committed to communal and gender justice uplift through mentoring, educating, and cultivating student leaders to effect social change for the good of all humanity. The Bayard Rustin Crown Forum provides innovative programs that confront and challenge systemic and cultural biases while promoting community engagement that ensures intellectual development and holistic growth for all persons. As nonviolent resistors, as change agents for society, as voices for the voiceless, and as prophets who speak truth to power, may we always remember we have an obligation to raise the moral conscience of America. Rustin's peacemaking over time has given rise to his own internal sacred worth. It is most evident in the posthumous award of the Presidential Medal of Freedom conferred to him by President Barack Hussein Obama. And hanging, might I add, on the wall of the Martin Luther King Jr. International Hall of Fame at Morehouse College with other luminaries is the oil portrait of this great giant, Bayard Rustin. On behalf of Dr. David Walrice and myself, we welcome you to this virtual space to be informed, challenged, and transformed by his witness.
Good morning. Thank you for being here today. In the midst of so much societal upheaval and uncertainty, I do not take your presence for granted. And so I want to make sure that I acknowledge and appreciate the ways that we've all come together in community, even if virtually, to be here with one another and for one another today. My name is Dr. Xavier Liverman, and I am an associate professor of feminist studies and critical race and ethnic studies at the University of California at Santa Cruz. I'm honored, excited, and humbled to have the opportunity to introduce today's speaker. I've been fortunate enough to be able to witness firsthand the sheer brilliance that is T. Anansi Wilson. In my classes at the University of Texas, where I've encountered them as a student and as a mentor to them through their PhD process. It will truly be one of my proudest moments as a mentor when I have the opportunity to see Tia Nancy progress from ABD to doctor. It will be well-deserved and well-earned, and it will add to their already impressive array of credentials. Tia Nancy Wilson is an award-winning scholar of law, literary, and cultural studies, a racial justice strategist, and an author of creative nonfiction. Their legal research is situated in legal philosophy, critical theory, political economy, and constitutional law. Their writing and scholarship primarily focuses on the history of Black thought, art, and imagination crafted in response to and resistance against the social, political, and legal realities of domination in the West. They seek to understand the processes of retrenchment after moments of social progress and how freedom dreams are nevertheless sustained. Wilson's work analyzes the ever-changing relationships between race, law, sexuality, power, and citizenship, both in the construction of law and policy and in the maintenance of the ways that we live our lives. They are particularly concerned with 4th, 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment questions. Their teaching interests include criminal law, criminal procedure, constitutional law, federal criminal civil rights, 4th, 13th, and 14th Amendment law, Reconstruction, political and civil rights, critical race studies, LGBTQ issues, and all areas pertaining to race, law, and society. Wilson employs critical race, Black feminist, performance, and women and gender studies in legal methodologies to examine how instances of extra-legal precedents of anti-Black violence and racial sexual terror continue to frame and impact notions of Black being and citizenship. Professor Wilson employs a multidisciplinary gaze to engage the creative, the legal, and the literary, to uncover an emerging approach to encountering, understanding, and extrapolating anti-Blackness as a jurisprudential logic underpinning the precedent embedded in the Constitution, the Federalist Papers, and the decisions that they inform. They received their JD from Howard University School of Law and are in the final stages of doctoral candidacy in African and African diaspora studies at UT Austin. They were selected as one of Blogger's 2017 Voices of the Year, as well as a keynote for their incisive writing. Tia Nancy was also recognized in 2012 as one of the top 100 emerging LGBTQ leaders by the White House Office of Public Engagement. Wilson has participated in racial justice dialogues and was an original member of the National Body Camera Working Group with former Attorney General Loretta Lynch, as well as the Black leaders of the nation's largest police department. Their work, keynotes, and insights have been featured in publications and organizations such as the Christian Science Monitor, thebody.com, Tulane School of Law, the Critical Black Studies Reader, Harvard University, the Department of Health and Human Services, Morgan State University, the DC Public Library, and the Harriet Tubman House in Boston. He announced his first offering, Godless Circumcision, a recollecting and a remembering of Blackness, queerness, and flows of survivance, is available on Amazon and Kindle, and it has been received or taught from spaces as diverse as DC Queer Collectives, the Harvard Law, Vassar College, UC Davis, VCU, Syracuse, and UC Berkeley. Please join me in giving a hearty welcome to Professor T. Anansi Wilson. Thank you.
Good day, good afternoon, good morning, everyone, wherever you are. My name is T. Anansi Wilson. I'm an incoming professor of constitutional and criminal law at Mitchell-Hamline School of Law, while I'll be opening a research center focused on the study of Black and Black queer life and Black letter law. I'm currently a professor at UC Hastings and an affiliated scholar at the Center for Racial and Economic Justice, where I teach advanced constitutional law, race, law and sexuality, and Black Lives Matter, retracing the Black and Black letter law. I'm in the process of finally finishing my PhD in African and African diaspora studies at UT Austin, and I am a proud graduate of the Howard University School of Law and Tufts University. I hope these upcoming words and these ruminations find you well, they find you warm, and they find you encased and enclosed in that melanated Black queer magic that our ancestors, your ancestors, saw fit to bequeath us with. Unfortunately, due to this pandemic, this ongoing pandemic, that continues to affect Black, queer, and trans folks at alarmingly disproportionate rates, in fact, we have lost over 70,000 kinfolk to this mismanaged crisis. Lives that mattered and continue to matter to us, but unfortunately few others. Due to this, I'm unable to be with you in person and am instead addressing you from the backdrop of my living room. Hopefully you don't hear too many dogs barking or neighbors moving or anything of that nature, but we are where we are. Hopefully, as this crisis begins to come to an end, we will not only see a ceasing of the loss of our lives, but we'll be able to meet and greet and celebrate each other in the flesh. The title of this address, this moment that we honor our brother and ancestor Bayard Rustin, is Black Queer Magic, the fierce urgency of us. You see, it is a fitting title for a man who grounded, celebrated, and elevated himself through an intersectional focus, long before such a word or even Sister Crenshaw existed. He did this by marking and noting and demanding that he not only be seen as simultaneously Black, queer, working class, and citizen, but also was hell-bent on putting the spotlight on and holding the fire to the racist, homophobic, and capitalistic nation designed and determined to make emancipation and citizenship both incomplete and impossible. We will return to Bayard, but first, I want to speak to the importance of another ancestor, one who came nearly 100 years before and is perhaps both the first known embodiment of what I'm calling and titling Black queer magic on these shores, and lived with urgency for freedom and dignity that has returned again in this moment of violence against Black, queer, and trans folks. We know only of this ancestor due to research and time of another Black queer kinfolk, Channing Joseph. And it is from his work and his forthcoming book titled House of Swan, Where Slaves Become Queens, that I'll cite this story. This ancestor was born enslaved in Maryland around 1858. While his legal name was William Dorsey Swan, his friends knew him as the Queen. According to Joseph, over his lifetime, Swan survived not only slavery, but the Civil War, police surveillance, torture behind bars, and of course, the twin terrors of racism and homophobia, and what likely operated as a precedent to transphobia and gender policing. Swan was formerly owned by a white woman named Anne Murray in Hitchcock County, Maryland. And it was from there in 1862, when Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, that he relocated to what we now sort of, kind of, maybe call Chocolate City or Washington, D.C. I want to pause here for a moment to underscore exactly what it is we are witnessing. Too often, we think about emancipation and the partial end of slavery as a moment where Black, queer, and trans people simply did not exist. This is not true. Because yet here we are, deep in the archive, at the ending of slavery, where a Black queer child is not only getting his first taste of legal freedom on the basis of race, but he is on the verge of asserting a type of racial, sexual, Black queer liberation too. You see, years later in DC, at the age of 24, Swan would not only have his first documented brush up with the law, but also offer us one of our first glimpses into resistance as a Black queer ancestral practice. Swan was arrested for petty larceny, specifically for stealing books from the Washington Library Company and some unknown item from the home of his employers, Henry and Sarah Spencer, who were the heads of the Spencerian Business College. He was sentenced to 6 months in jail, while others accused of the same crime arising from the same incident had already been released on bail. I wonder what the difference between Swan and the others may have been. Again, let us pause to consider the issue here. 6 months in prison, 6 months, 180 something odd days for taking books from the library. Freedom wasn't all that free then was it? Despite the horror of his treatment here, what stands out is the fact that Swan's character, his Black queer magic, if you will, was as such so powerful, so potent, so puissant that folks, his employers, that he pled guilty to stealing from, filed a presidential pardon on his behalf with the support of the sentencing judge and even the assistant U.S. attorney that prosecuting him. And they stated that he was free from vice, industriousness, refined in his habits and associations, gentle in his disposition, courteous in his bearing. And excuse me, I misspoke. He was industrious. Not free from industrious, but industrious, which means he did everything he could to be independent, to make a living based upon his own wit, his own skills, his own talents, what he had known, and the things that he'd been able to grasp, the things he'd been able to learn in an era where it was oftentimes illegal for Black folks to read. The petitioners also note that he was trying to improve his education and provide for his family. He had 2 younger brothers. And that the Spencers would happily offer lifetime employment as a college janitor, as he had been working before. However, this is not how Swan became known as the Queen of Drag, or our first drag queen, if you will. On January 14th, 1887, Swan was hosting what appears to be one of many balls. Now, these are not wholly dissimilar from the balls thrust into popular culture by brilliant shows like Pose, Shout out to all the dope folks like Twiggy Garcon and others that were involved in this. But where Poe centered on creating community through individual houses and community competition, the Balls of Swan operated as a sanctuary for the Black, queer, and formerly enslaved. We must think of his home and the balls that he hosted as a type of underground railroad specifically for Black queer folks who had nowhere else to go, whose very presence was deemed criminal and immoral and punishable by myriad laws and the whims of private citizens, both Black and white, and newspapers trading in scandal and public scorn. You see, there was a magic to operating in plain sight and an urgency to the home and world making of Swan and his companions. The night of this particular ball, Swan's home was raided, and it would not be the first, nor would it be the last time. The Washington critic reported at the time, 6 colored men dressed in elegant female attire were arraigned in the dock at the police court this morning on a charge of being suspicious persons. Pause, think about that. The criminality in which he's being accused of, the crime of which he's being accused of is suspicion. Does that sound familiar? They nearly all had on low neck and short sleeve silk dresses, several of them with trains, as well as corsets, bustles, long hose and slippers, and everything that goes to make a female's dress complete. So I want to take a step back before I move forward and just pause. We're talking about the 1880s, a time when Black people are not subject to a minimum wage, a time when things like tips, we think about this now in terms of waiters, right? And other people doing service work, they get a minimum wage of like $2.25, and then you tip them to make up the difference and pay them for their service. But we forget is that tips come out of slavery. And this is the only wage that a formerly enslaved person gets. And so somehow, Swan and his community were able to take whatever little money they were supposed to be subsisting on. There was no living wage. There was no housing laws for Black folk. There's no Civil Rights Act at this time. There are no rights. Besides, you cannot be officially enslaved. And they were able to find and purchase silk. I want to talk to you about genius and Black queer magic. But continuing, according to Channing Joseph, drag balls have been going on in secret for years. Invitations to the dance, for instance, were often whispered to young men at the YMCA, and newspapers described the arrest of several Black men wearing bewitching fascinators, silk socks, or cashmere dresses while en route to balls. So think about this. We're talking about 1880s. Washington, D.C. Black men walking down the street in the middle of the night in silk gowns. If you've seen Bridgerton, you know what I'm talking about. Looking like the queen in Bridgerton. Walking with willful abandon, knowing that their life is at risk and still choosing to move through these streets. A claim to dignity. In 1882, Swan served a jail time for selling plates, silverware, and other party supplies. But the 1887 raid was the first time the wider world learned of him and the motley group of messengers, butlers, coachmen, and cooks. You see, Swan had a community, but put differently, in the wake of slavery, in the midst of widespread government and social control of Black bodies and sexuality, and in an era of widespread lynching, Swan deeply, earnestly, and often invested in the early notion of us as Black queer community and conjured all of his wits, brilliance, and his magic to create a safer space for folks like us. Again, citing Joseph, Swan's drag balls came with grave risk to his guest reputations and livelihoods. A large but undetermined number managed to flee during the police raids, but the names of those arrested in jail were printed in the papers, where the men became targets of public scorn. Mugshots. With the news coverage, the world took an interest. Everyone from neighbors and police to local officials and even psychiatrists. Now that the group was publicly known, it would prove to be a fascinating new subject for researchers trying to grapple with the complexities of human sexuality and psychology. You see, they lacked any of the terms we use today, like cross-dress or transgender and gender non-conforming. In fact, Dr. Charles Hamilton Hughes described Swan's group in 1893 Medical Journal, as an organization of colored erotopaths. Erotopaths. Think about erotopaths. People who are being noted as having a psychological disorder that comes from their sexual desire, which is same-sex desire, assumed by the psychologist. And they're also called a lecherous gang of sexual perverts. Another psychiatrist, Dr. Irving C. Ross, described them as a band of Negro men with androgynous characteristics. On the one hand, the publicity made it more difficult for Swan and his friends to stay hidden from those who thought to do them harm. On the other hand, now that their existence was widely known, more people might have been interested in joining his secretive all-male family, a secret society. In my own words, put differently, Swan's newfound hypervisibility both endangered his life and marked him as a beacon of safety, of protection, love, and dignity, and for those living in the shadows of Black life and anti-Black homophobic terror. An early example of what Huey Newton once called revolutionary suicide, and that is this notion that the revolutionary should expect as the consequence of challenging the system, when you walked freely as yourself, demanding freedom for your people, you would be killed. But another brother or sister would surely pick up the banner, continue the work, all while continuing the same cycle of watering the seeds of freedom with our blood for a day where freedom would be the environment that envelopes us all. However, Swan's most consequential mark on history occurred at another raid on April 13th in 1888. The Washington Post headline read, "Negro Dive Raided. 13 Black men dressed as women, surprised at supper and arrested." Let's stop again. Here you are, recently coming up from the South, the Deep South, born enslaved. Your Blackness is already a cause for arrestability. It is already implied criminality by the color of your skin. Whether you're standing or sitting, whether you're moving or being still, you are subjected and understood to be a particular type of criminal by way of the condition of your birth, that is Blackness. And now here you are, having dinner. According to Joseph's research, more than a dozen escaped as the officers barged in and Swan tried to stop them, launching himself down the stairs at the police, boldly telling the police lieutenant, and this is what I love, who was in charge. He said, "You is no gentleman." In the ensuing brawl, the Queen's gorgeous dress of cream-colored satin was torn into shreds. The fight was also one of the first known instances of violent resistance in the name of LGBTQ rights. You see, we often think about Stonewall as the first time that Black and Afro-Latinx folks stood up and said no more. But this was about 100 years before, and it had been lost to the archives until one of us, one of our Black queer kin, did the work. The newspaper clipping reads as follows. The title quote says, "He kept a hell of iniquity. Judge Kimball sends Dorsey Swan down for 10 months. And we know what to be sent down means. It's hard labor. William Dorsey Swan, the colored man at whose house, number 1504 L Street Northwest, a drag, was raided about 2 weeks ago, and who was convicted in the police court last week of a charge of keeping a disorderly, something about black queer folks is disorderly gathered together, house, was sentenced to 10 months in jail by Judge Miller on today. This is the case in which a number of men, white and colored, were found in this place, which Judge Miller characterized as a hell of iniquity. There were several colored men and one white man reported to be of the character of Swan, the character, the essence. And during the trial of the case in court, there appeared young men of respectable parentage who told of how they had visited this place, danced, and indulged in strong drink of all kinds, from beer to champagne. A large stock of liquors found on the premises was in court as evidence, but Dorsey said they didn't have to buy the liquor. In disposing of the case, Judge Miller told of the fearful revelations made at the trial, the downfall and ruin of young men, and said he only wished he had power to impose a 10-year sentence. Quote, he says, "I would like to send you where you would never again see a man's face," said the judge, "and would then like to rid the city of all other disreputable persons of the same kind. You see, thieving and petty assaults amount to nothing as compared with the conduct of these people." Note this. The conduct that he speaks of is black queer folks having supper, having drinks, dressing up nicely in the finest of clothes and loving who they will. The article continues. Mr. Maloney for the prosecution asked for a year's sentence, but this court did not impose, but instead gave him even more, 10 months. "10 months in jail for having dinner and being in community, for holding a community space." When I speak of black queer magic and the fierce urgency of us, this is exactly what I'm speaking of. The courage of folks like Swan to engage in a sustained demand for dignity, and not to merely wait for it to be bestowed by either government nor neighbor. No, much like freedom and power, dignity is something that must be taken for oneself. Swan did this under the penalty of imprisonment, under the penalty of torture, under the promise of death. For this last offense, the crime of enjoying life while simultaneously black and queer, this is before the notion of civil rights had yet matured. In fact, the Civil Rights Act of 1883 was only 4 years old and had swiftly been struck down as an unconstitutional overreach by Congress. And it spoke nothing, even if it would have been upheld, of black queer folk or queer folk writ large. You see, Swan was tortured in prison, and he nearly died of heart problems, which the judge who first received his pardon request dismissed as paling in comparison to the crime of his morality, his immorality. His existence was seen as immoral. This was the crime of his being, the crime of his birth, the crime of him being true to himself. This was courage. This was love. This was for us. This is our heritage. The critical practice of love. Critical love ethics is what I called it in my book, Godless Circumcisions. Even when death stares us in the face. Bayard once said, When an individual is protesting society's refusal to acknowledge his dignity as a human being, his very act of protest confers dignity on him. To be afraid is to behave as if the truth were not true. Bayard says, I believe in social dislocation and creative trouble. Or as John Lewis would say, good trouble. This is how he lived his life. This is how we must live our lives and how we are called to live our lives. We have a lineage, a genetic and spiritual lotus star and roadmap that instructs us how to be free, how to remain free, how to do so with dignity, and in community with our neighbors. This is the call of William Dorsey Swan. This is the call of Bayard Rustin. This is the call of Essex Hemphill and countless others who have come next and dared us to live in the face of the threat of death. Maya Angelou once said, my goal in life is not merely to survive, but to thrive with passion, compassion, humor, and a little bit of style. That is what we are called to do. In 1992, near what we believe to be the height of the HIV/AIDS crisis, we know now, today, that 1 out of every 2 Black men will contract HIV in their lives, Black gay men rather, despite age and zip code, and 58% and 51% of new HIV cases among trans people are Black trans men and women respectively. In the wake of 92, and perhaps knowing what's coming next, Essex Hemphill wrote the following poem. The occupied territories. You are not to touch yourself in any way or be familiar with ecstasy. You are not to touch anyone of your own sex or outside of your race and then talk about it, photograph it, write it down in explicit details, or paint it red, orange, blue, or dance in honor of its power. Dance for its beauty, dance because it is yours. You are not to touch other flesh without a police permit. You have no privacy. The state wants to seize your bed and sleep with you. The state wants to control your sexuality, your birth rate, your passion. The message is clear. Your penis, your vagina, your testicles, your womb, your anus, your orgasm, these belong to the state. You are not to touch yourself or be familiar with ecstasy. The erogenous zones are not demilitarized. Essex Hemphill, The Occupied Territories, in the Book of Poetry, Ceremonies. It has been 30 years since this poem was penned with the potency of blood, love, and dignity, snatched from a nation ridiculing the disease as gay cancer or gay-related immunodeficiency disease. Yet we continue in this moment, right now, to live in a world where same-sex sexual relations only recently became legal, 17 years ago, where marriage and military service became permissible in the last 8 years, and where trans folks only became able to serve freely in the last few months. That being said, you may emerge homeless and unemployed from the wedding chapel because it is still legal to fire someone for being lesbian, gay, bisexual, queer, or gender non-conforming. You see, our lives are still subject to strict private and government scrutiny, discrimination, and yes, terror. Not a decade ago, here, On these streets in Atlanta, a black queer couple, asleep on one of their mother's couches, was doused with boiling hot water with the stepfather noting, "They look like two dogs stuck together, so I thought I'd help them out." We live in a moment where black trans women have a life expectancy of 30 years, often killed at the hands of our straight brothers and sisters, and I'd imagine a few queer ones too. And if they're lucky enough to survive, they can be arrested, like Monica Jones in Phoenix and countless others in New York City around the country for what they call walking wild trans. This is currently the state of black queer life, but it does not have to be so. In order to change this, we must summon our collective black queer magic and recognize the power and urgency of us, together, here and now, despite our collective and individual differences in gender, in sexuality, religion, and location within the diaspora. In fact, our differences combined create the very pot liquor that will free us. It is time that our tongues come untied. It is time that we remember and recall that we were both unbossed and unbought, as Shirley would tell us. It is time for us to reemerge in the making of our ancestors like William Dorsey Swan, a slave demanding freedom in every part of his life and every part of his body and his essence. Bayard Rustin, who said, "Even for the movement of civil rights, I must be whole, I must be one, and I must be me in order for us all to be free." And Essex Hill, whose own blood was seen as a form of bioterrorism in this nation that we call home. Ancestors like Marsha P. Johnson and Sylvia Rivera, who risked their lives to fight back against officers who've tried to forcibly remove them from a bar when they were just enjoying themselves. A gay bar that rarely, barely, ever allowed them to come in. Tyrone Garner of Lawrence versus Texas, who was actually the reason the case came to the Texas court and as well as the Supreme Court, because he was first racially profiled. Someone accused him, a former lover, accused him of being a black man waving a gun in the air who had broken into an apartment when in fact he was hanging out with someone his ex-lover didn't like. And Rotimi Fani Kayode, who was disowned by his family or royal bloodline in Africa for being black and queer simultaneously and having HIV/AIDS. You see, the time is always, always, always already right now. Because we have nothing to lose but our chains. And if we refuse to take the risk, to do the work, to unshackle ourselves and our loved ones and even our hated ones and our neighbors, well, we've already lost the promise that our ancestors died for. Thank you so much for this opportunity to speak with you today. I hope to speak with you all again soon. Find me on social media or wherever. Thank you for being in community. You're on board.